What if the weakest among us held the power to save the mightiest, in the brutal frost of the northern kingdoms? A cast-aside outcast didn't just survive the winter, she stepped between certain death and the royal heirs. This is a tale of betrayal, survival, and a love that defied destiny. The harsh winds of the Scardale peaks showed no mercy to anyone, least of all an Omega without a pack. Ailsa trudged through the knee-deep snow, her tattered woolen cloak pulled tight over her trembling shoulders. Just a fortnight ago, she had a home. But when her designated mate, Cormac, a rising warrior in the lowland valleys, decided an Omega was too weak to bear his legacy, the elders banished her. In the dead of winter, an exile was a quiet death sentence, yet Ailsa possessed a stubborn will to live. She survived on frozen berries and the meager warmth of hollowed-out pine trunks. The cold had numbed her limbs, but it had not dulled her sharp senses. It was on the dusk of the 15th day that her ears twitched at a sound that did not belong to the howling wind. It was a whimper, high-pitched, terrified, and undeniably young. Ailsa froze, her golden eyes scanning the darkening forest. Through the dense curtain of falling snow, she spotted movement near a jagged ravine. Two small pups, no older than 5 winters, were backed against a wall of sheer ice. One possessed fur the color of midnight, while the other was a mottled grey. They were shivering, their tiny teeth bared in a desperate, futile display of bravery. Pacing in a semicircle around them were 3 rogue wolves. Their pelts were mangy, their ribs showing through their flanks, driven to madness by winter starvation. They were massive, their jaws snapping as they closed in on the defenseless pups. An Omega was wired to submit, to run from danger, to seek the protection of a stronger wolf. Ailsa had no strength, no size, and no weapon. But as the largest rogue lunged forward with a guttural snarl, something ancient and fierce snapped awake inside her chest. She did not think. She only moved. Ailsa shifted mid-leap, her small, russet-furred wolf form hurtling through the air. She slammed into the leading rogue's side just before his jaws could close around the dark-furred pup. The impact sent both Ailsa and the rogue tumbling into the snow. The rogue recovered quickly, shaking off the surprise, and turned his ravenous fury upon her. "Run!" Ailsa barked in the primal tongue of their kind, putting herself squarely between the snarling beasts and the children. The rogues attacked in unison. Ailsa fought with a chaotic desperation. She used her smaller size to her advantage, darting under their heavy strikes, biting at their ankles, and thrashing through the deep powder. But she was severely outmatched. Claws raked across her flank, tearing through her coat. A heavy paw swiped her muzzle, sending her skidding across the ice. Crimson stained the pristine white snow beneath her. Yet every time she fell, she dragged herself back up, standing as an unbroken shield before the crying pups. She was losing her vision, her breathing turning into shallow, ragged gasps. The largest rogue reared up to deliver a fatal strike. Then the ground trembled. A roar so deafening it seemed to crack the very ice in the air echoed through the ravine. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated dominance. Bursting through the tree line came a beast out of legend. He was a towering timber wolf, his coat a pure, striking silver, his eyes glowing like blue glacial fire. This was King Stellan, the Viking alpha of the northern reaches. Behind him charged his elite guard, Conrad, his massive enforcer, and Oswald, the seasoned tracker. In mere seconds, the battle was over. The rogues, recognizing the terrifying aura of the Alpha King, attempted to flee. but Stellan's guards descended upon them like an avalanche. Stellan himself did not bother with the retreating scavengers. He shifted back into his human form, a towering mountain of muscle covered in thick furs, his chest heaving with exertion. He fell to his knees in the snow, gathering the two crying pups into his massive arms. "Bram, Cale, by the gods!" Stellan breathed, his deep voice cracking with a father's terror. Ailsa, battered and struggling to stay conscious, watched the reunion through half-closed eyes. She reverted to her human form, her frail body shivering violently as the adrenaline faded, leaving only agonizing pain. She curled into a ball on the frozen earth, expecting the Alpha to turn his wrath upon her next. Intruders in Scardale territory were rarely shown mercy. Stellan handed the pups to Conrad, who had returned from securing the perimeter. The king then turned his piercing blue gaze to the small, broken woman lying in the snow. He approached her slowly, his heavy boots crunching menacingly. "An Omega," Stellan murmured, his tone unreadable. He knelt beside her. "You are an outcast." "I only wished," Ailsa choked out, her voice raspy. "I didn't hurt them." "You shielded them," Stellan corrected, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a strange, resonant vibration that made Ailsa's heart flutter despite the pain. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand brushing a snow-covered lock of auburn hair from her pale face. The moment his skin made contact with hers, a violent jolt of electricity sparked between them. Stellan's eyes widened, the glacial blue darkening. Ailsa gasped, the sudden warmth radiating from his touch, fighting back the winter chill. The impossible scent of pine, wood smoke, and raw lightning enveloped her. "Mate." The word echoed in both of their minds, unbidden, shocking, and entirely unwelcome to a grieving king and an exiled Omega. Stellan quickly withdrew his hand, his jaw clenching tight. He stood up, towering over her. "Wrap her in furs," he barked to Oswald. "We bring her to the fortress. She lives. By my decree." The royal fortress of Scardale was a marvel of stone and timber, built directly into the side of a towering mountain. Giant hearths roared with endless fires, casting long, dancing shadows against the tapestries that depicted ancient pack victories. Yet, to Ailsa, the grand halls felt as cold and hostile as the forest she had just left. For 3 days, she was confined to a small, comfortable chamber in the healer's wing. Bridget, an older female with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, tended to her wounds with poultices of moss and bitter herbs. Ailsa learned much from Bridget's idle chatter. She learned that King Stellan had lost his Luna, the mother of his pups, to a sickness 3 winters ago. Since then, his heart had turned to ice. He was a fair ruler, but ruthless, heavily reliant on his inner circle to manage the pack's domestic affairs. The most prominent of this inner circle was Rowena, a high-born female from a wealthy allied family. Rowena had taken over the care of the young princes, Bram and Cale. On the 4th morning, Ailsa felt strong enough to walk. She wrapped a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the stone corridors. She hadn't gone far when 2 small bodies crashed into her legs. Ailsa, young Bram cheered, his midnight hair a stark contrast to his pale, joyful face. Kyle, the quieter of the 2, simply hugged her knees tightly. Ailsa's heart melted. She knelt, wincing slightly as her healing side stretched, and wrapped her arms around them. "Look at you 2, safe and warm. You saved us from the monsters," Kyle whispered, looking at her with wide, reverent eyes. "Where is your caretaker?" Ailsa asked, glancing up and down the empty stone corridor. "You shouldn't be wandering without a guard." "Rowena is sleeping," Bram said casually. She always sleeps when the sun is high. Ailsa frowned. A royal caretaker neglecting the heirs before she could question them further. The sharp clacking of heels echoed against the stone. Rowena turned the corner, her face a mask of elegant fury. She was beautiful, with sleek blonde hair and sharp, aristocratic features, but her eyes held a cruel glint. "Get your filthy hands off the princes, you feral stray!" Rowena spat, marching forward and snatching Cale by the arm, roughly enough to make the boy yelp. Ailsa stood up, her protective instincts flaring. "Do not handle him so roughly. He is a child. He is royalty, and you are a pathetic Omega who should have frozen in the woods," Rowena hissed. She leaned in close, her scent a cloying mix of heavy perfumes that failed to mask an underlying scent of sour anxiety. "Do not think you belong here just because the king took pity on you. You are nothing but a burden. Keep away from the pups, or I will ensure you are thrown back into the snow." Rowena dragged the crying children away. Ailsa watched them go, a knot of deep unease forming in her stomach. Something was incredibly wrong. How had the pups ended up miles away from the fortress during a blizzard in the first place? Rowena was supposed to be watching them. That evening, a feast was held in the great hall to celebrate the safe return of the heirs. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, hearty stews, and overflowing drinking horns. Ailsa was given a small seat at the very end of the lowest table, far from the raised dais where King Stellan sat. Stellan looked magnificent, a crown of iron and dark ironwood resting on his brow. Yet, his eyes continuously drifted to the back of the hall, seeking out Ailsa. Every time their gazes locked, the heavy, electric pull of the mate bond tugged at Ailsa's soul, leaving her breathless. As the night wore on, Ailsa noticed Rowena speaking in hushed, hurried tones with a tall, scar-faced guard named Hagen. Hagen was Stellan's beta, a man known for his brutal efficiency. He nodded at Rowena, slipped a small leather pouch into her hand, and melted back into the shadows. Ailsa's senses went on high alert. She quietly abandoned her meal, keeping to the shadows of the massive stone pillars as she tracked Rowena's movements. The caretaker bypassed the main kitchen and slipped into the antechamber where the children's meals were prepared separately. Peeking through the heavy wooden door, Ailsa watched in horror as Rowena uncorked a small vial taken from the leather pouch. She hovered over 2 silver bowls of sweet porridge meant for the pups. Ailsa inhaled sharply. Even from the doorway, she recognized the faint, earthy scent. It was not a deadly poison, but weeping root, a powerful sedative that caused deep, unnatural sleep, often leaving the victim confused and weak. If given in large doses to children, it could permanently damage their minds. Rowena tipped the vial. "Stop!" Ailsa shouted, bursting into the room. Rowena spun around, dropping the vial. It shattered on the stone floor. Panic flashed in the aristocratic woman's eyes, quickly replaced by calculating malice. As Ailsa lunged forward to inspect the bowls, Rowena let out a piercing, theatrical scream that echoed all the way to the great hall. Within moments, the antechamber was flooded with guards. King Stellan pushed his way through the crowd, his face like a thundercloud, with Hagen right on his heels. "What is the meaning of this?" Stellan demanded, his alpha aura pressing down on the room so heavily that Ailsa was forced to her knees. "My king!" Rowena cried, throwing herself at Stellan's feet and sobbing convincingly. "I caught her. The Omega I walked in, and found her trying to poison the princess's food. Look at the shattered glass." Ailsa stared at Rowena in shock. "No, she is lying. She had the weeping root. Why would Lady Rowena harm the children she has raised?" Hagen stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, glaring down at Ailsa. But an exiled Omega, bitter at the world, looking to cause chaos in the pack that took her in, that is a story we all know too well. The murmurs of the gathered pack members grew loud and hostile. Real names from the crowd. Conrad. Bridget. Oswald muttered in confusion and growing anger. Ailsa looked up, her golden eyes locking onto Stellan's glacial blue. She saw doubt in his face, a struggle between the undeniable mate bond pulling him toward her, and the logical, damning evidence presented before him. King Stellan. Please, Ailsa pleaded, her voice trembling but resolute. Smell the porridge, smell her hands. She is trying to harm your sons. Rowena immediately shoved her hands into the folds of her heavy gown. She is delusional. She attacked me. Stellan stood silent, the weight of the crown heavy upon him. The pack waited for his judgment. A single word from him would send Ailsa to the executioner's block. He stepped forward, his massive shadow falling over the kneeling Omega, and reached for the silver bowl. Stellan lifted the silver bowl. The antechamber was suffocatingly silent, save for the crackle of the hearth and the ragged breathing of the accused. The king closed his eyes, centering his heightened alpha senses. To an ordinary wolf, the porridge smelled only of sweet oats and wild honey. But Stellan was no ordinary wolf, his lineage traced back to the ancient frost-born kings. He inhaled deeply, filtering through the layers of scent. Beneath the sugar and milk lay a faint, undeniable bitterness. Damp earth, crushed roots, the unmistakable, paralyzing taint of weeping root. Stellan's glacial eyes snapped open, blazing with a terrifying inner light. He slowly lowered the bowl to the wooden table. The clatter of silver against timber sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet room. He did not look at Ailsa. He turned his imposing frame entirely toward the aristocratic caretaker. Rowena, Stellan said, his voice dropping to a deadly, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone walls. Present your hands. Rowena's porcelain face drained of all color. She took a step back, her beautiful features twisting into a mask of pure terror. My king, you cannot possibly believe this feral stray over me. I am of the house of Cedric. My family has served. Present your hands to your king. Stellan roared, the sheer force of his alpha command bringing several lesser guards to their knees. Rowena trembled, tears spilling over her lashes, but she refused to pull her hands from the deep pockets of her gown. She cast a desperate, wide-eyed look toward the doorway. That was all the confirmation Stellan needed. But before he could issue the order for her arrest, the heavy scrape of steel leaving a scabbard echoed through the room. Hagen, the trusted beta, stepped forward, his sword drawn and gleaming in the torchlight. But the blade was not pointed at Ailsa. It was leveled directly at King Stellan's chest. The king is compromised, Hagen shouted to the gathered guards, his voice booming with forced authority. The Omega has bewitched him. She uses dark, southern magic to cloud his mind and turn him against his most loyal subjects. Seize the king and kill the stray. For a fraction of a second, the room stood entirely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the beta's treason. Then, chaos erupted. 4 guardsmen Ailsa recognized from the courtyard, loyalists to Hagen named Silas and Gideon, among them drew their weapons and lunged toward Stellan. Treason! Conrad bellowed, bursting through the crowd with Oswald right behind him. The loyal enforcers slammed into Hagen's mutineers, the antechamber instantly transforming into a brutal, confined battlefield of clashing steel and snarling wolves. Get the pups, lock the iron door, Stellan commanded Conrad over the din of battle, parrying a vicious thrust from Silas. Ailsa did not wait for the guards. While the massive men fought, She scrambled across the floor, dodging heavy boots and swinging blades. She threw herself into the adjacent nursery, where Bram and Kyle were huddled together, weeping in terror. Ailsa slammed the heavy oak and iron door shut, sliding the massive deadbolt into place just as a heavy body slammed against the other side. "Ailsa," Bram cried, burying his face into her stomach. "Hush, little ones. I am here." Ailsa panted, her healing side burning with fresh agony. She backed them away from the door, her eyes fixed on the heavy wood as it shuddered under repeated impacts. Outside, the battle was brief but devastatingly bloody. Hagen had miscalculated the depth of Stellan's fury. The Beta had assumed that 3 years of grieving a dead Luna had made the king soft. He was fatally mistaken. Stellan did not bother shifting into his wolf form. He fought with the brutal, calculated efficiency of a Viking warlord. He disarmed Silas with a shattering blow to the man's wrist, then spun, catching Gideon by the throat and hurling him across the room into the stone hearth. Hagen, realizing his coup was collapsing in seconds, lunged at Stellan with a desperate, two-handed strike. "You are weak, Stellan." Hagen spat, their blades locking with a shower of sparks. "You mourn a ghost while the pack starves for conquest. I would have made Scardale a true empire. The Pups were a weakness, tying us to a soft future." "They are my blood!" Stellan roared. With a twist of his massive wrists, he shattered Hagen's blade. Before the Beta could react, Stellan's fist connected with Hagen's jaw, a sickening crack echoing over the groans of the wounded. Hagen collapsed to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the stone. The remaining mutineers dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in submission. Rowena, who had tried to slip away in the confusion, was dragged back into the room by Oswald, her aristocratic finery torn and her face pale with the realization of her doom. Stellan stood breathing heavily amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his knuckles bruised and bloodied. He wiped a streak of blood from his cheek and turned his fierce gaze toward the heavy iron-bound door of the nursery. "Ailsa," Stellan called out, his voice instantly softening, losing the terrifying edge of the alpha and taking on the desperate plea of a father and a mate. "Ailsa, it is over. Open the door." Inside, Ailsa's trembling hands gripped the heavy iron bolt. She slid it back, the metal protesting with a loud screech. The door swung open, and the 2 young princes immediately rushed out, wrapping their arms around their father's massive legs. Stellan dropped to his knees, burying his face in his son's hair, breathing in their scent, assuring himself they were completely unharmed. Then he looked up at Ailsa. She stood in the doorway, her plain woolen dress dusty from the floor, her face pale, yet her golden eyes burned with an unbroken, resilient spirit. She had not run. She had not cowered. The weakest wolf in the pack had, for the second time, stood between his bloodline and certain death. "Take the traitors to the ice dungeons!" Stellan commanded his loyal guards without looking away from Ailsa. "They will face the tribunal at first light, and send for Bridget. The boys need rest." As the room was cleared, leaving only the king, the Omega, and the sleeping Pups now carried away by the healer, a heavy, charged silence fell over the antechamber. The air practically hummed with the invisible, electric tether binding them together. The days that followed the failed coup reshaped the very foundation of the Scardale pack. The tribunal was swift and unforgiving. Hagen and his conspirators were stripped of their ranks and banished to the deep ice, a punishment worse than death in the merciless northern winters. Rowena, stripped of her titles, was exiled back to the southern lowlands in disgrace, a living warning to any who dared plot against the royal bloodline. Yet, the greatest shock to the pack was not the betrayal of their beta. but the elevation of the outcast. Stellan did not banish Ailsa back to the healer's wing. Instead, he moved her into the royal apartments, assigning her the grandest chambers adjacent to his own. He draped her in furs of snow leopard and cloaks of spun silver, completely ignoring the traditional hierarchies that dictated an Omega must serve from the shadows. For Ailsa, the transition was dizzying. She had spent her entire life being told she was less than dirt, a burden meant to be tolerated until she was discarded. Now, she was surrounded by opulence, fiercely protected by the most powerful wolves in the north, and constantly in the presence of a king whose gaze made her blood sing. One crisp, clear evening, exactly a month after the coup, Stellan summoned Ailsa to the highest balcony of the fortress. The sky above was a breathtaking canvas of deep violet, violently slashed with the brilliant, dancing greens and pinks of the aurora borealis, the northern lights reflected in the endless expanse of snow-covered pines below. Ailsa stepped onto the balcony, wrapping a thick cloak of white wolf fur tighter around herself against the biting chill. Stellan stood at the stone parapet, looking out over his domain. He turned as she approached, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "You called for me, my king?" Ailsa asked softly, her heart performing its usual frantic flutter at the sight of him. "I did," Stellan said. He closed the distance between them, his towering frame providing an instant, comforting shield against the mountain wind. He reached out, his bare, calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. The spark of the mate bond leapt between their skin, settling deep into their bones as a warm, undeniable truth. "And I have told you, Ailsa, when we are alone, there are no titles between us." Ailsa swallowed hard, looking up into his glacial eyes. "Stellan, it still feels like a dream. Only weeks ago, I was freezing in the snow, waiting for the end. And instead, you became my beginning," Stellan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He took both of her small hands in his massive ones. "I have spent 3 years wandering in a frozen wasteland of my own making. I let my grief blind me to the rot growing within my own home. I was supposed to be the protector. Yet it was you, the one the world deemed the weakest, who saved my sons, who saved me." "I only did what my heart demanded," Ailsa whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek, instantly cooled by the wind. "And your heart is the strongest weapon in Scardale," Stellan declared fiercely. He dropped to one knee upon the frost-covered stone. Ailsa gasped, taking a step back. "Stellan, what are you doing? An alpha does not kneel. A king does not kneel to an Omega. This king bows to his equal," Stellan said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "The old laws are ash. The hierarchy is meaningless in the face of the goddess's will. You are my fated mate, Ailsa. You are the mother my sons have chosen. You are the fire that brought the spring back to my winter." He looked up at her, his blue eyes entirely devoid of their usual harshness, filled only with a profound, earth-shattering devotion. "I do not want you to simply reside in my fortress. I want you to rule it with me. Will you accept my mark? Will you stand beside me, not as a sheltered Omega, but as the Lunar of Scardale?" Ailsa looked down at the fearsome Viking king kneeling in the snow for her. All the years of rejection, the cruelty of her former pack, the pain of being cast aside by Cormac, it all melted away, replaced by a radiant, overwhelming warmth. She was not broken. She was exactly where she was meant to be. "Yes," Ailsa breathed, pulling him up by his hands. "Yes. Stellan, I will be your Luna." Stellan let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. He pulled her flush against his chest, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of snow, wind, and eternal devotion. The bond snapped fully into place, a roaring inferno of connection that linked their souls, their minds, and their strength. The coronation and mating ceremony was held on the night of the winter solstice, the most sacred night in the northern packs. The great hall was transformed into a paradise of evergreen boughs, blooming winter roses, and thousands of glowing candles. When Ailsa entered the hall, walking hand in hand with Stellan, a hush fell over the thousands of wolves gathered. She wore a gown of deep crimson velvet, the colour of life and vitality, a crown of intertwined silver branches and moonstones resting upon her auburn hair. Bram and Kyle walked proudly behind her, carrying the train of her heavy cloak. No one saw a weak Omega. They saw a survivor. They saw the female who had stared down starvation, rogues, and treason, and emerged victorious. As Stellan formally presented her to the pack, sinking his teeth gently into the crook of her neck to leave the royal claiming mark, a deafening cheer erupted that shook the very foundations of the mountain. Conrad, Oswald, and Bridget led the howling, their voices joining together in a primal song of loyalty and love that echoed up to the starry heavens. Ailsa stood upon the dais, holding the hands of her new sons, her shoulder pressed firmly against the unyielding strength of her Alpha King. The outcast who had been left to die in the snow had not merely survived the winter. She had conquered it, bringing a new dawn of warmth, justice, and unyielding love to the frozen north. Did you love Ailsa's incredible journey from a rejected outcast to the fierce, beloved Luna of Scardale? If this story of survival, betrayal, and fated love made your heart race, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your pack, leave a comment with your favorite plot twist, and make sure to subscribe for more epic werewolf romance audiobooks. Your next great adventure is just a click away.